All right, so let's dive into this whole Ron DeSantis thing, right?
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense. It's a wild thought, especially with all the controversy around Trump's original pick.
Yeah, Pete Hegseth is facing some serious allegations, to say the
Oh,
least.
yeah.
Sexual assault, alcohol
Yeah.
abuse, financial mismanagement. There's a lot of pushback against him. So does this mean DeSantis is like a strategic move, for Trump to calm things down? Or does Trump actually think DeSantis can run the Pentagon?
Well, to even get at that, we got to unpack who Ron DeSantis even is. His background is pretty interesting.
It really is. I mean, we're talking captain of the Yale baseball team,
Wow.
Harvard law grad,
Okay.
then boom, Navy JAG Corps, Guantanamo Bay deployment to Iraq alongside SEAL Team 1.
Oh.
Bronze Star.
So, yeah, that's some serious military experience.
Ooh.
But is that enough to run the entire Department of Defense? That's a whole other world,
Oh,
right?
totally. The Pentagon needs a very specific skill set. Managing this gigantic budget, global responsibilities, working with tons of people. It's not just about knowing how to fight a war.
Right. Okay, so let's look at his political career then.
Yeah.
And this is where things get a bit more controversial, I guess.
Well, his time in the U.S. House gives us some clues. He was one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus, so a pretty staunch conservative stance. And when he was campaigning for governor, he was definitely on board with Trump's policies.
Yeah, and all those conservative ideas really came out when he was the governor of Florida, right? All those anti-woke policies that were all over the news. He went after diversity and inclusion programs, which makes you wonder how he'd handle the U.S. military.
For sure. DeSantis has said that he wants to rip the woke out of the military, get rid of DEI initiatives, reverse policies on transgender personnel. Could mean big cultural shifts for the armed forces.
And how would all that affect recruitment and morale in the military, especially in such a diverse force?
Yeah, it's a tough one. DeSantis says that the current woke policies are why recruitment is down. But his critics say these big changes could alienate people and make morale even worse. It could have huge consequences.
We can't just focus on policies, though. We need to understand the man behind him, right? What kind of leader is he? What's his personality like?
Well, he's been called ambitious, assertive, even polarizing.
Right.
He's known for being decisive, but some might say uncompromising. These traits have helped him politically, but could they be a problem in a job like this? Where you need to be diplomatic and work with others.
That's a good point. The Secretary of Defense is on the world stage, right? Dealing with allies and enemies. Could his assertive style make it harder to get things done, to work with other countries?
It's definitely possible. To really get into that, we need to look at some key moments in his career, like how he dealt with the COVID pandemic as governor. That was both praise and criticize.
Right.
He made some big decisions, went against what a lot of people were saying, and that gives us a peek into how he might handle things as Secretary of Defense.
His actions during the pandemic were really divisive, especially him resisting mask mandates and vaccine requirements. It showed that he's willing to stand his ground even when everyone's pushing back.
Exactly. That can be seen as strength or as recklessness. Would that same decisiveness work at the Pentagon? Or could it lead to rash decisions with really bad consequences?
That's what we'll look at next. We'll unpack more of his background and his political moves. What were some of his big decisions, and how did he handle those high-pressure situations?
One thing that stands out is how close he is to his wife, Casey DeSantis.
Right.
She's a big name in Florida politics and has been a huge influence on his career. Understanding their relationship and how she might advise him could help us understand how he makes decisions.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. A lot of times a leader's personal life can give us clues about what motivates them and their weaknesses.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into DeSantis's life, we'll see how his experiences, his family, and his political battles have shaped how he sees the world. What makes him tick? What are his driving forces? We need to know these things to understand how he might act as Secretary of Defense.
This is getting really interesting. So what are the big takeaways from this first look at DeSantis?
Well, it's obvious that he's got a solid military background and is a strong conservative. His decisive, sometimes assertive leadership style could be both good and bad. But to really know if he'd be a good Secretary of Defense, we have to look at his foreign policy views, his ideas about military spending, and his overall vision for the U.S. military.
We've got a lot more to cover, and we want you listening to be part of this deep dive. What stands out to you about Ron DeSantis so far? What questions do you have? Share your thoughts in the comments and come back for more as we break down this complex and fascinating guy.
Okay, so let's look at DeSantis's foreign policy views for a minute. Because the Secretary of Defense isn't just, managing troops and money. They have to play the global game, understand alliances, and know how to respond to threats around the world.
Yeah, their decisions impact way more than just the U.S., right? So what clues do we have about how DeSantis sees the world?
Well, one thing that's clear is that he really supports Israel. He said that he thinks they're America's most important ally in the Middle East and wants to make that relationship even stronger.
That kind of fits with his overall hawkish view, right? He seems to want America to be more assertive globally.
Right, and that's especially obvious in his views on China. DeSantis sees China as a big rival, a threat to America's power, both economically and militarily. He criticizes their trade practices, their military expansion in the South China Sea, and how much influence they're gaining all over the world.
So it sounds like he's not really into diplomacy and would rather push back against China's actions,
Yeah, that's probably accurate. He doesn't seem to trust international groups like the United Nations, and he hasn't been a fan of big military interventions either.
which all points to his whole America First idea,
Yeah.
right? Putting American interests above everything else when it comes to foreign policy.
Exactly. He seems to think that America's safety and economic success are the most important things. So how would that actually play out if he becomes Secretary of Defense?
I can see him pushing for more defense spending, especially in areas where China is growing fast, like cybersecurity, space warfare, and AI.
Yeah, I think that's a safe bet. He's already said that the U.S. needs to modernize its nuclear weapons and build more ships for the Navy. But all that is expensive. Where would the money come from?
Exactly. Would he cut other parts of the government's budget? Would he want to increase the deficit to pay for all that military spending? Those are tough decisions that would affect everything the government does and could even impact people's everyday lives.
Right, and it shows what his priorities would be. Would he focus so much on the military that things like education, healthcare, and social programs would suffer?
And what about the possible consequences of being more confrontational with China? I mean, some people might like the idea of seeing China as a threat, but it could also make things more tense and increase the chance of actual conflict.
You're right. It's about finding a balance, standing up for your interests without being too aggressive. And that's where DeSantis's personality and how he makes decisions comes back into play.
Yeah, because even with good intentions, one wrong move on the world stage could lead to disaster.
And the Secretary of Defense has a lot of power. Their choices have huge consequences. People could live or die based on what they decide. So it's not just about what DeSantis says he'll do, but also how he works under pressure, how he comes to decisions, and if he's even capable of being diplomatic and handling all these complicated situations.
It seems like he isn't afraid to make big decisions, even if they're unpopular. We saw that when he was governor, especially with how he dealt with the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, his response to the pandemic was pretty telling. He went against the flow, didn't give in to pressure, and focused on getting the state open again. Whether you agree with those decisions or not, they show that he's got strong beliefs and isn't afraid to do things his own way.
But that independent streak could be worrisome for a Secretary of Defense. Making a decision about a state policy is one thing, but when you're dealing with global alliances and the potential for war, it's a whole different story.
That's true. It makes you wonder if he can work well with others and if he'd be open to hearing different opinions, especially from military advisors or leaders from other countries.
So moving forward, we need to look for clues about how DeSantis actually makes decisions. How does he get information? Who does he trust for advice? How does he react to criticism? These are all important things to think about when we're trying to figure out if he'd be good in this job.
And we can't forget the human side of things. DeSantis is a husband and a father. How do those relationships affect his choices? Does he talk things over with his wife? Does he consider how his decisions might impact his family when he's making big choices?
It reminds us that even the most powerful people are guided by personal motivations and values. Understanding those things can tell us a lot about their leadership style and how they handle challenges.
This deep dive is showing us that there's more to Ron DeSantis than just his anti-woke policies and what he thinks about China. It's a mix of experiences, relationships, and beliefs.
We've just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
But even now, it's clear that if DeSantis becomes Secretary of Defense, it would be a big turning point for the U.S. military.
And it would have a huge impact on the whole world. So as we continue looking at his background, his policies, and his vision, we want you to be part of it. What are your first impressions of DeSantis? What parts of his leadership are you most interested in or worried about?
Share your thoughts, your questions, and anything you're concerned about in the comments below. Let's keep talking about this because the future of America's security affects every one of us. Okay, so we've talked about DeSantis' background, his politics, his take on foreign policy.
Hmm.
But what about his vision for the future of the U.S. military? Where does he want to take it and how?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's one thing to deal with what's happening now, but real leadership is about getting ready for what's next. And from what he's said and done, it seems like DeSantis wants a military that's smaller, faster, and totally focused on the threats he thinks are most important.
So not so much about big traditional wars, more about being adaptable and responding quickly.
Exactly. He's talked about making decisions faster at the Pentagon, cutting wasteful spending, and giving more power to commanders out in the field. It's about being ready to handle whatever pops up wherever it happens.
Sounds good in theory, but what would that actually look like? What kind of changes might we see?
Well, it could mean shifting money away from things like huge armies and putting more into special ops, cyber warfare units, and groups that can be deployed quickly and fight in unconventional ways. Less about tanks and battleships, more about drones, hackers, and targeted missions.
It's almost like he's getting ready for a different kind of war, right? One that's not about brute force, but about technology and strategy.
That's a good point. And it reflects how war is changing in the 21st century. Technology is more important than ever. But it also makes you wonder, would the U.S. military be ready for a big fight like a war with China or Russia if they go this route?
Yeah, that's a real concern. You got to be ready for all kinds of threats, not just the ones you expect. If you're only focused on one type of conflict, it could leave you open to others.
Definitely. That's why having a clear, well-thought-out vision for the future of the military is so important. It can't just be about reacting to what's going on right now. It has to be about understanding and shaping the future of war itself.
So where does DeSantis stand on some of the other big military issues we face today? Things like climate change and nuclear weapons. Those are concerns that go way beyond just military stuff.
On climate change, he said publicly that he doubts it's a big threat to national security, and he's against trying to reduce the military's carbon footprint. This puts him at odds with a lot of military leaders who think climate change could make current conflicts worse and create new ones.
That could cause some real problems between DeSantis and the military establishment if he becomes Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, it could. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, he's very tough. He thinks America needs to keep its nuclear weapons and make them even better to deter enemies.
He said that the U.S. can't let other countries like China and Russia get ahead in the nuclear arms race. But that could make things more dangerous, too. It could escalate tensions globally and make nuclear disarmament even harder, which a lot of people think is essential for world peace.
It's a complex problem, no easy answers. And it shows the kind of decisions a Secretary of Defense would have to make. Every choice has trade-offs, risks, and potential consequences that you didn't intend.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Ron DeSantis,
Mm-hmm.
what have we learned about him? What are the key takeaways and what questions are still out there?
Well, it's clear he's a complicated guy. He's got this unique mix of experience, ambition, and strong beliefs. He's got a solid military background, a very conservative outlook, and a leadership style that's decisive and sometimes even aggressive. He's not afraid to shake things up and go against the flow, which could be good or bad.
It seems like he sees the future of the U.S. military as being nimble and technologically advanced. But some people wonder if that would really prepare the country for all the different threats out there. And what he thinks about things like climate change and nuclear weapons could create problems both within the military and in how the U.S. interacts with other countries.
At the end of the day, whether Ron DeSantis has what it takes to be a good Secretary of Defense is up to each of you to decide. We've given you the information, looked at his background and his vision, and now you have to form your own opinions.
This has been a fascinating look at a guy who could potentially change the American military and its role in the world. But the conversation doesn't stop here. What are your thoughts on Ron DeSantis? What do you think is most promising or concerning about his leadership? Let us know what you think.
Leave your comments, your questions, your worries down below. Keep the discussion going because what happens to America's security affects all of us.
And that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored Ron DeSantis and what it would mean if he became the next Secretary of Defense. If you found this episode interesting and thought-provoking, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something important happening in the world.